Hey there, all you cool cats and kittens. Our topic this week in management is looking at decision making, and in particular, how as managers we might go about trying to make good decisions. Now, the thing with this topic is that a lot of the content is going to seem really, really common sense and really obvious. But the thing is that when the pressure is on and when things become very complex, often the basic principles of decision making can tend to go out the door. So what we're going to do is go through a simple decision making process that sort of breaks it down into 8 steps. So that when we come to then making a more complex or a more difficult decision, we can start to remember this simple technique that might enable us to work through that process in a way that will take out a lot of the emotion and hopefully take out a lot of the complexity. So when we're talking about decision making, the model that they present in the book is a set of 8 steps that takes us through the identification of the problem, which is the decision that we're trying to make. So what is the problem we're trying to solve by making that decision? How are we going to select some options or potential solutions? And then how might we evaluate the effectiveness of the solution that we come up with? And so in entrepreneurship, we talked a lot about the idea of problems and the idea of solving problems in order to create value for somebody. And in the management unit, we talk about a problem as some kind of discrepancy, so a difference between what currently is the state of play or what currently exists and what we want to exist. Yep, so we identify that gap as the problem that we're trying to solve by making that decision. And then in the model, they'll talk a little bit about the decision criteria. And so these are the factors that we identify that are particularly relevant to the decision that we need to make. So let's dive into that model. So this is an image of it. We're actually going to step through it step by step, using the example that they use in the book, which is the process of deciding which car to purchase. And we're going to make the assumption that you're a manager and you need to make a decision to buy a new car for whatever reason. And so we're going to walk through these 8 steps, which are, first of all, identifying what the problem is, then identifying what are the criteria that we're going to use to make the decision, the allocation of weights to those criteria, development of the different alternative solutions that we might have, then the analysis of those different solution alternatives, finally the selection, and then implementation. So this is where we've actually made our decision and so we've purchased the car. And then how might we evaluate whether that we've made the right decision. So we're going to kick off, first of all, it takes us through this process of identifying the decision criteria and allocating weights. But I want to focus a little bit at first on the idea of identification of a problem, because this is often where we get stuck in our decision-making processes because we think that we understand the problem and we don't quite understand it well enough. So we make a lot of assumptions. So we talked a lot about this in entrepreneurship, about getting good at how we understand and really deeply understand the problem that we're trying to solve. And so some of the techniques that we used in entrepreneurship was like the asking why a lot. So if we say, well, what's the problem? I need a new car. Why do you need a new car? Because my car that I have is broken and can't be fixed. Okay, and so why is not having a car a problem? Well, it means I can't get to work. Why is not being able to get to work a problem? Well, because I can't work from home because I have a lot of client meetings, and so I also need to be able to use the car to get out to client meetings, etc., right? So we're trying to dig in, and that's a fairly obvious example. So it's not a very complex problem that we're looking at. But by starting to really go beyond the surface level or the kind of initial understanding of our problem, we're actually going to be able to get a deeper understanding of how we might then start to try and approach coming up with a solution to that problem. So let's dig into our next stage, which is where we're getting into our decision criteria. So this is the example that they provide us in the book, and this is the step where we're going to actually start to identify what are the factors or features that are going to be important in this decision. So in the case of buying a new car, we might come up with a list of features of a car or things that are going to be important in our decision. And so the things that they've identified in this example are the factors that are going to be important are price, the interior comfort, the durability of the car, the repair record, so, you know, is it prone to breaking down, that sort of thing, which would go into the kind of overall cost of managing and having that car on the road, the performance of the car and the handling of the car. And then the third step, so this is the first step, is identifying what are those key criteria. They're going to be the factors that are going to help us understand what's important in this decision. And then we're going to rate them and rank and weight them. So here you can see that effectively what they've done is put them in order, and then given a weighting to each of those criteria. So they've identified that price is going to be the most important criteria, and that it's going to be 10 times more important than the handling of the vehicle. Yep. And so they've given different weightings to each of those criteria based on how important they think each of those criteria are in terms of the overall decision. Now, the thing about buying something like a car is that it's often a very personal decision. And so if we were buying a car for us as an individual, our criteria and our decision-making process might be quite different to if we're doing it as a manager and we're buying it, you know, on behalf of a company. And so having that sort of thing, this is what we call a rational decision-making process. So it's very much a kind of thinking from our head and trying to make the most rational, calculated, shall we say, decision, as opposed to something that's just going to make us feel good, which might be more of the case if we were buying a car for ourselves. We might be more interested in just buying a car that we really like. Whereas as a manager, we're often trying to make more rational, calculated decisions. So once we have an understanding of what our key criteria are, and the order and sort of weightings of how we might rank and rate those different criteria, we then move on to looking at what are our different potential solutions, right? So in this particular case, it's going to be the different types of cars or makes and models of cars that we might choose to purchase. And so let's dig into that. So first of all, we're going to actually start to identify what each of our different options are. And so here you can see that they've listed all these alternatives. So they've got the Hyundai, Ford Focus, blah, 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 blah. And then what they've done here is they've given each of these different cars a score out of 10 for each of the criteria. So leaving aside the weightings for a moment, this is just each car has been rated out of 10 for each criteria. So in this case, the Hyundai, they've obviously looked at the price of a Hyundai and they've given it 8 out of 10 in terms of that it's probably a cheaper car than, say, a Toyota Prius, because they've only given it 2 out of 10. And so then they've probably gone and sat in each of these cars and then rated the interior comfort, and they've given the Hyundai 10 out of 10 because it's a super comfy car. And then some of these other ones are less comfy, so they've given them 7s, etc., etc. They've looked at the fuel economy, the safety ratings, handling, and the warranty. And so they've scored each of these different criteria out of 10 across each of these cars, and then they've totaled it up. And so as you can see, the Hyundai's come out on top, then followed by the Mazda 3. Yep. So now what we do is we start to apply our weightings, because this is where we start to get not just how do we compare the cars just across the criteria, but by prioritizing the criteria that we really care about. So that then means that we need to mathematically calculate these different alternatives. So you can see that here they've put in the weighting. So under initial price, they've got the weighting of 10. And here you can see the 10, and then through to warranty, which is rated 1 as a priority. And so then they've done this calculation. So the Hyundai, they gave it 8 out of 10 for price, weighted by 10 gives it an 8. So then, as you can see, once we've done the maths, that multiplies the rating that we've given that particular criteria by its weight, we end up with these totals. And as you can see, the Hyundai still comes out on top, and is considered to be, based on our calculations of our evaluation and assessment of these different alternatives, on the basis of this rational approach to decision making, we would choose to buy the Hyundai. So then we actually go and implement our decision. So we've made our selection, we're going to buy the Hyundai, and now what we need to do is actually make sure that implementing it is going to work okay, because it's one thing to make the decision, it's another for it to kind of work in the real world. And so we need to also involve people who are going to be affected by that decision. Now, the earlier we can do that in the process, the better, because if we just sit down by ourselves and decide, oh, this is going to be our selection criteria, it's going to be the fuel economy and all that sort of stuff, and then we go and buy a Hyundai, and then we come back and people say, oh, but this car's too small, like we're not going to be able to fit in it, or we need to be able to fit 5 people in the car for the company, and this can only fit 4. So that effectively needed to be part of your decision-making criteria, but you haven't captured that early enough. So being able to include people who the decision is going to affect in that decision-making process early on, and particularly in the formulation of the problem that you're trying to solve, the better your implementation is going to work, because not only are people going to have contributed to what's important in this decision, they're also then going to be invested in helping make sure that the implementation works and is effective. And so then our last part of our decision-making process is some way of actually understanding and evaluating if the decision has been effective or not. Yep, so if we remember back to chapter 1, where we talked about efficiency and effectiveness being 2 cornerstones of good management. So we want to make sure that our decision has been effective in terms of our resource usage. And so there might be a range of different ways that we're going to do that. And we're going to dive into a lot more detail on this when we look at the topic of control later in the semester. But, you know, evaluating a decision could be as simple as just getting feedback from people, or observation. You know, you buy the Hyundai, you get in and you drive around and you decide if, yeah, this is a good car, I'm really happy with this decision. Or you might monitor it over time. You know, you might start to track the fuel efficiency, you might start to track if it breaks down, all these sorts of things, or you might start to notice things that you think, oh, actually in retrospect, the size of the car is actually really important to me. I didn't factor that into the last time I made this decision. So next time I'm going to make sure that I factor that in as a criteria in my decision-making process. So that is the topic of our 8 steps for decision-making and what is called the rational approach to decision-making. And I'll catch you in the next video.